proud to announce that this project was SURF funded and also has helped get him secure to his PhD at MSU. So he'll be continuing this work along with many others.
Hello everyone. So my name is Grant Clark and I'm happy to present on my soon-to-be thesis, Should Citizens or Politicians Draw the Lines? A Michigan case study focused on redistricting reform in the state of Michigan. So I'd like to start today with a quote from the second President of the United States, John Adams. It should be, in miniature, an exact portrait of the people at large. It should think, feel, reason, and act like them. This was the belief that he and many of our founding fathers had for the United States House of Representatives, for it to be the part of our federal government closest to the people, to which its members would be directly elected by them every 2 years. That was the simplistic vision of voters choosing the politicians that represent them in government. However, throughout American history, there have been politicians of all stripes that have inserted themselves into this equation. For centuries, politicians have engaged in what is known as gerrymandering, when electoral lines are drawn to benefit a particular faction or political party. They do this practice during what is known as the redistricting process. This is when, usually at the beginning of the decade following the census, electoral districts, whether they be for Congress or the state legislature, are redrawn to reflect changes in population and demographics. But often, this is used to advance the career interests of politicians and their political party. But why are we talking about this in 2026? Normally this is something that happens right after the census at the beginning of the decade. So normally this is a non-issue by the middle of the decade. It's an issue now because across the country, there is an ongoing effort to do what is known as mid-decade redistricting. This was started by the Trump administration's efforts in Texas to successfully secure 5 more seats for the Republican Party ahead of the midterm election. And this propelled into a national conflict, whether it be in North Carolina, California, and now voters in Virginia deciding on new electoral districts as well. So once again, it has entered the spotlight. How do we finally rid ourselves of the centuries-old threat to representative democracy? Many propose that it should be not only the rules changing, but who draws the lines entirely. Many advocate for the use of commissions in the redistricting process, which is actually not uncommon across the United States. As of 2021, nearly half the states in the Union, 22, incorporate some sort of commission in the redistricting process. But the gold standard in the eyes of many anti-gerrymandering activists is what is known as an independent redistricting commission, sometimes referred to as an IRC. IRCs have 2 distinct qualities: their composition and their authority. So in terms of their composition, the IRC is comprised not of elected politicians, but of citizens that are representative of Democrats, Republicans, and independent/unaffiliated voters. And second is authority. As I mentioned, commissions are not very uncommon, but in many cases, commissions just serve an advisory role. They make suggestions to the state legislature that they can freely ignore if they would wish. But an IRC is vested with total authority over the redistricting process, unimpeded by the partisan interests of the state legislature. By that strict definition, the Campaign Legal Center only identifies 4 states that have proper IRCs, one of them being the state of Michigan. And the state of Michigan in particular has become a national example in the eyes of many in the academic, activist, and political worlds as a potential model for the rest of the country. So before we discuss the commission, I'd like to get a little bit of the background as to how we got to this commission being established. So for decades, there has been chronic legal issues over redistricting in the state of Michigan. You can go all the way back to the inception of the now current state constitution in 1963, but for purposes today, we're going to start in 2010. So in 2010, the Republicans were recovering from a big defeat in the 2008 elections to Barack Obama and his Democratic Party. And there was a national effort led by the Republican Legislative Committee to prioritize flipping state legislative chambers critical for the redistricting cycle to hopefully secure control of the U.S. House for the rest of the 2010s. They injected $1 million in Michigan alone between Labor Day and Election Day in 2010. And they were able to successfully get full control of state government, including retaining the state Senate, winning back control of the state House, and electing Rick Snyder as governor. With that power, the Republicans were able to implement congressional and state legislative maps that disproportionately advantaged Republican candidates throughout the 2010s. As a part of that backlash, an interest group called Voters Not Politicians was established in 2016. And them and their allies, through a 2-year grassroots campaign, successfully lobbied for the amending of the state constitution to change who does redistricting from the Michigan legislature to what would become the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, sometimes referred to as the MICRC. And this was widely popular in 2018. In the midterm election, it got over 61% of the vote and won 67 counties, you'll see on your screen here. Many of these counties being counties that Trump won 3 times. So what is the MICRC? The MICRC is comprised of 13 members. They are chosen by a multi-step lottery process overseen by the Secretary of State's office. 4 of them are self-identified Democrats, 4 are self-identified Republicans, and 5 are not self-identified with either political party and are labeled as unaffiliated. There are strict requirements for being on this commission. If you are a politician, a registered lobbyist, for example, or the relative of those, you cannot serve on the commission. And so the commission is required to do its business in public hearings as an attempt to promote transparency. And given the 2020 redistricting, that was during the COVID era, much of this was through Zoom meetings. But there was also town hall functions across the state of Michigan, in which Michigan residents and interest groups can lobby for how they would like to see their communities drawn in the maps. And so once they do this work, they're also abiding by a set of criteria outlined in the state constitution. One of those criteria I'd like to bring your attention to is the fact that there's not to be a disproportionate advantage for any political party. That is going to be important later. But once the commission is able to establish the maps that it would like to pass, it requires majority support in the commission, but also the support of at least 2 of the 4 Democratic members, 2 of the 4 Republican members, and 2 of the 5 non-affiliated members for it to pass. But the MICRC is an interesting case study because of this disproportionate advantage clause. It is the only IRC in the country that explicitly mandates partisan fairness. You'll have some others that will have language about competitiveness, but that's a different thing. So what my research is focused on to see is, as the MICRC upholding its promise to Michigan voters, is it producing congressional and state legislative maps that don't have a disproportionate advantage for either political party compared to the maps that came before it passed by the Michigan State Legislature? So the key issue in this research is, what is partisan fairness? Because without context, it can be a very subjective term. So political science literature has outlined a number of tests to help us determine whether or not a map might have a partisan advantage for a political party. And today I'm going to discuss 3. The mean median difference, the lopsided margins test, and the partisan symmetry test, sometimes called the partisan bias test. So the mean median difference, this looks at, if we look at the results across the state, the average vote share that a party gets in all the districts combined. And you minus that by the average, by the vote share in the median district in the state. For the lopsided margins test, this looks at, as the test kind of implies, how lopsided the margins are for the districts a party wins. Because this can be important for sorting out two key features of gerrymandering that you might have heard in a political science class: packing and cracking. If we see evidence that a political party is getting a high concentration of the vote in the districts they win, this could be evidence of the voters being packed into a smaller amount of districts where they have a higher concentration of the vote. Or it could be evidence of opposition voters being cracked into enough unwinnable districts to which the ruling party's voters are more effectively spread throughout more districts. And lastly, for the partisan symmetry test, this is on a hypothetical. Let's say that both parties, in this case we're looking at through a 2-party lens, the Democrats and the Republicans, both got the same amount of votes statewide. How would that look seat share-wise if that were to happen? So first, with the mean median difference. As you see on your screen here, this is based on the first cycle of implementation. As the political science literature indicates, that if we are to see partisan gerrymandering, we expect the strongest impacts to be in the first few years of implementation. So for the state legislature maps in the 2010s, that was 2012 for Congress and 2012 for State House, but 2014 for State Senate, because the State Senate is not during presidential election years. And for the MICRC, because the first cycle of implementation was in a midterm election cycle, for the Congress, State House, and State Senate maps, that was all 2022. So for this test, we're looking to see if there is a value higher than 3 or lower than -3. as the literature indicates that that is a sign of significance that could lead to a disproportionate advantage under this test. As you see on your screen here, the partisan advantages for the Republican Party under this map range from about 6-7 percentage advantage points across the congressional, state house, and state senate maps. And a similar disparity when you look at it from the Democratic side, a disadvantage around 6-7%. But you will notice when you look at the MICRC maps, the final statistics on the chart, you will notice there's still some slight disparities, but they do not rise to the level of significance. So as we move on to lopsided margins test, you'll see on your screen here that under the state legislature approved maps in the 2010s, Republicans enjoyed advantages ranging from 12 to nearly 15-16 points in these maps. But you'll see those disparities fall significantly, 3.19 or below in all cases under the maps passed in the 2020s by the MICRC. Lastly, we look at the partisan symmetry test. So again, we're looking at a 50-50 scenario. In a 50-50 scenario under the 2010 era Michigan legislature maps, they would have produced results giving Republicans 64% of congressional seats, 58% of state house seats, and a whopping 68% of supermajority of seats in the state senate. Compare that to the maps passed by the MICRC, and you will notice for Congress, you have a half-seat advantage for the Democrats, and considering it's a 13 seats, you can't have 50-50 because it's an odd number. And for the state house, you only have a 1-seat advantage for the Democrats as opposed to the 9-seat advantage we saw for the Republicans under the state legislature approved maps. And for the state senate maps, you have an exact 50-50 breakdown in a 50-50 scenario. So in conclusion, using a variety of tests as outlined in political science literature, we do see evidence that the MICRC has produced maps that do not have a disproportionate advantage to any political party, compared to the maps passed by the state legislature, which had clear evidence of a disparity in favor of the Republican Party. This is important because, as I mentioned earlier, this is being viewed as a case study across the nation. There are politicians in recent Congresses that have tried to pass legislation that would incentivize or mandate their use across the country. But it's important to see in the states where it's already in existence if they're actually fulfilling their promises, or if it's just another political phenomenon that'll come and go. But all of this is important to achieve one thing, to make sure that our houses are a portrait of the people and not a portrait of the politicians. Thank you.
Questions for Brant?
Yes. What body or who would monitor the changes in districts throughout the states if they do change the political map?
If they have failed or something?
No, say a state would adopt the Michigan standard.
Mm-hmm.
Who would monitor to make sure, or that would verify that they were in fact doing that?
I think that would be a subject for academic research in the future to look at those individual case study analyses. But I think this each commission has different qualities. So I think you're going to see, if it's implemented in another state, you're probably going to see differences as opposed to the Michigan system. But I think it's up for further research to see how those bodies compare to the Michigan example.
Anyone else?
So I was curious, when you say that they have 5 non-affiliated political party people in the IRC, how, obviously there's still biases that exist even if you don't align with a political party, how do they kind of filter through to ensure that there's the lowest amount of bias possible among that group of people?
Yes, so that is a point that is brought up by critics of the commission as to how we can make sure that these non-affiliated voters are actually what they say to be non-affiliated. So you do have the criteria in terms of making sure that you don't have lobbyists and elected officials on there, and also the fact that you're required to have support from at least two members from each group, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and 2 independents, is kind of meant as a mechanism to prevent that kind of concern.
Maybe one more.
You had a question?
Yeah, what would the potential federal legislation look like? Could Congress impose this system nationwide, or would it face constitutional challenge?
I think it depends on the legal grounds that they implement this on, because it's very clear throughout American history that most election policy is handled at the state level. I mean, there are some arguments as to potentially that Congress does have a constitutional obligation to ensure a Republican form of government in the states. So you can maybe make something out of that legal argument, but that is an ongoing issue that could face the courts.